Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards. This is a video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards from the board game Dominion. So today we're looking at Council Room. This is a 5-cost action card from the base game. It says plus 4 cards, plus 1 buy. Each other player draws a card. So this is a terminal draw card. There's quite a lot of them in the base game. Now in the Smithy video, I talked about this card like template, a fairly standard sort of card that you find across all the expansions, and that is a terminal plus 3 cards with some sort of bonus that costs 5. I tend to treat Council Room as one of these cards. The bonus is that all players, including you, draws an extra card, and you also just get an extra plus 1 buy. So that each other player draws a card is a big deal here. The extra card tends to be better for your opponent than it is for you, and that is because the extra card that your opponent gets always appears at the start of their turn. Now, the start of your turn is the best time to basically get extra cards, and that is because usually whether or not you have a good turn or not can be considered by whether you're able to kick off, as we call it, and that means that your starting hand, it needs to have the village and the smithy in order to get going with your turn. I say village smithy, obviously I'm always using that as a generic example, but obviously there are a lot more cards, types of cards you get, but you're usually looking to pair up certain things, so it's just a lot easier to do when you start your turn with a larger hand size. For this reason, Council Room tends to be worse than other similar sort of draw cards, I would say, so a lot of the time you will find that you will be picking up other stuff instead of Council Room. Let's go a little bit more detail into the various bits of Council Room here. So Council Room is a card that makes the game very fast when someone picks it up. Just having extra cards in your hand does a lot, and this does that for all players. So everyone is having better turns when someone is playing Council Room. But different types of decks are all trying to end the game at a different time, usually, and unless players are playing the same thing. What you tend to find is someone usually wants the game to go short, and that's the person who might be in the lead at the time, while the other player is looking to try and extend the length of the game a little bit. So the typical idea that a deck will go short is when someone is trying to rush through the province pile, or alternatively with a strategy like Workshop Gardens, they might be looking to empty all the piles as quickly as possible. It's really important with Council Room that you take careful attention to what sort of strategy your opponent's going for. That is because the value of that each other player draws a card is going to depend a lot on what they're doing. Certain decks really like that benefit a lot more than others. So a typical example is big money. I don't like to talk about big money that much in these videos because I think it's not a very useful strategy, even though it's very basic. This is just where you pick up like the silvers, golds, duchies, provinces, and you tend to find like one other thing. It's usually terminal draw to go with it, because terminal draw is really good for those strategies on its own. What you find with just standard big money, like Smithy big money, for example, the 6 and 8 price points are really, really important for big money. You don't tend to care that much about 4 or 5 or 7, but gold is very, very good for big money. You want to hit 6. And as you know, at the start of the game, your deck's not very good at making 5. So even if you're going for like the typical engine strategy, as we call it, you may find that you end up buying a silver or 2 just so you can try and hit 5 a bit more often. But it's actually still quite hard to hit 6. You can do it on turn like 3 or 4, but you're not going to do it that often. So a sort of a big money player really, really wants to try and hit 6 as much as they can early on to get golds, because they are way better than silvers. And if you get like an early Council Room and you start playing it, what you find is it's just so much easier for them to hit 6, because every card you are drawing them is going to be around about 1 coin, probably a bit more, and it's just so easy to get 6. So you can really speed up like big money decks if you're playing Council Room and your opponent is going for big money. Just by you playing it, you make them do a lot better. In addition to that, anytime you're playing Council Room, then Council Room is available as a card for your opponent to pick if they want to do a big money strategy. And giving +4 cards is quite good. right? That's quite a lot of cards. So they find it very easy to hit like 8, and they get an extra buy as well. Now, when you are playing with multiple players, so more than 2, so you got 3, 4, like 5 or 6, what you find is that Council Room Big Money can end up being quite strong and fairly dominant. And one of the reasons for that is because if multiple people are playing Council Room Big Money, then the Big Money players are sort of helping each other out to hit 6 and 8 a lot, because they are also playing Council Room, and that makes the other Big Money player has now more cards in their hand. So what you find is that outside of 2-player games, depending on who you're playing with in the groups, Council Room Big Money can sort of start to dominate games. In 4 or more players, there's also less provinces per player. There's only 3 instead of 4. So rushing down the province pile actually becomes easier. It's a lot harder to build complex and interesting strategies once you get a 4th player or more, just because, there's less cards per pile per player, like generally overall. So these sort of very quick try and rush down provinces strategies work well, and Council Room can sort of dominate those. So if you've ever, you're new to Dominion, and you find that you're really struggling to beat Big Money strategies, sometimes you find what it is that they're trying to build an engine, but they're playing a lot of Council Rooms, and that just sort of really helps an opponent who's just doing Big Money. So Big Money is sort of the strategy that really, really likes it when their opponent plays Council Room. So that's sort of why I'm mentioning this here. So you've got to watch out for that. Like I say, it's Big Money's not super great, but it can be decent if your opponent is helping you do it. Now, the extra card, there's timing here. The extra card is usually more valuable earlier on in the game than it is later. Sort of the extra card from Council Room, as the game goes on, starts to feel like it means less and less as decks get better. So early on, typically what we're really trying to do is hit certain values to get certain cards. There's going to be a lot of games where 5 or even 6 is going to be quite good, because there's a lot of very powerful cards available at those price points. 5 is sort of the point where cards should generally start getting very strong. And you want to try and add, in a lot of games, as many 5-cost cards into your deck as you can. It's not always going to be true, obviously, but just sort of as a general overview, there's only so far you can go with general advice and overviews in Dominion, of course, but you really want to add cards into your deck that are, if they're more expensive, they're going to be better. And generally, if you have a plan to add certain cards and they're all expensive and you keep missing that price point, then that's bad, because you don't get to actually build your deck the way you want. If you want to add cards to your deck in a certain order, the first thing you've got to do is actually afford the cards that you want to buy. So just by giving your opponent an extra card early on can make a big difference. It can make more than it does later on in the game. In addition to that, your deck's smaller at the start of the game. You're usually trying to do stuff like trash cards as soon as you can, and that means your early turns are also going to be a little bit worse in terms of money, so that's another reason Council Room's better. Makes it easier to trash and still buy good stuff. Also, because your deck is smaller, by drawing an extra card, that's a better proportion getting through your deck. And if you think that someone opens Council Room on turn 1 or 2 because they get a lucky 5 card hand on turn 1 or 2, playing that Council Room means that your opponent is also less likely to miss a card if it ends up as the 11th card of their deck as well. So you just sort of get all these sorts of benefits early on with having that extra card. Now, later on in the game, particularly if your opponent is also doing a deck drawing strategy, you may find that they can start drawing their deck anyway, no matter about you adding an extra card to their hand. So once they get to that stage, you don't really know whether or not giving them an extra card is actually going to help them or not. It could be that they could have drawn their deck anyway without it, and so you can find that extra card is essentially completely useless, right? They still would have drawn all of their deck without it. So Council Room, generally if there's other draw available, you find that you tend to get other draw early on, but later on you might choose to go for Council Room because it gives you an extra card, which is going to be nice for you if you want to add a draw to your deck. Because normally you want to add as much draw as you can, prepare some extra overdraw for when you start adding in provinces. And also the buy is usually going to be quite nice once your deck is up and running, because then you're more likely to be able to use it. So Council Room is more of a late game card than an early game typically. Now, this is sort of an early combo that people realise in the base game. Militia Council Room. So Militia says discard down 2/3 cards in hand. That's a fixed value, and so it doesn't matter how many cards your opponent started with in their hand, they have to keep discarding until they reach 3. So if you're drawing them a load of cards with Council Room, and then you end your turn after you've drawn your deck with a Militia, your opponent has to go all the way back down to 3 again. So this sort of is considered a way to negate the problems of Council Room, because your opponent's always going to start with a 3-card hand no matter what you draw them. Militia's, of course, not the only example. I've got Goons and Ghost Ship here as examples of way to reduce your opponent's hand size to 3. Ghost Ship is slightly different because they top deck the cards instead of discard them, but they're all sort of the same general concept. Now, these 3 cards here are specific because it does say down to 3 cards in hand. Sometimes you do get discard attacks that only discard 1 at a time, like Urchin, and those are obviously not going to be quite as good, although Pillage is probably an exception case, because you get to throne it, and you actually get to use it twice instead of once if your opponent had a 6-card hand, but I haven't listed them here. There's more discard attacks. It's not meant to be a comprehensive list, but just something to keep in mind. So here you go. Like I say, you can use Council Room as your main draw, and you can actually start getting it earlier if you have stuff like Militia on the board, because you get that opportunity to just cancel out the extra large hand size at the start. Now, it's not a full cancelling out. I'm sure you've probably realised that getting to keep your best 3 cards out of 5, is not that great, but getting to pick the best 3 cards out of 7 or 8 cards, you are much, much more likely to end up with your opponent still getting a good turn. If you think they're much more likely to find a Village and Smithy pair and then keep those cards in their hand, if they had a lot more cards to look at, you sort of increase the search space of the 3 cards that they want to keep. However, bear in mind that sometimes this also means that they are more likely to have to discard some good cards. So if you think that you are playing Council Room and you're drawing them a load of villages and smithies, and then you play a militia, they might have to end up discarding a bunch of those villages and smithies, and that can actually hurt their ability to finish drawing all of their deck. Now, if instead they draw a lot of non-drawing payload, they draw a bunch of treasure cards, and they get to discard those, then that can be really good for them because they wanted those to be drawn at the end of their turn, and so by putting it in their discard pile, they get to wait until later. But, a lot of these things, you're not actually really going to know whether you're helping your opponent or not when you play these. So I think that sort of idea that the Militia's not as bad with Council Room, while that's sort of overall true, you still want to play it, and I don't think that it's that much worse. The idea that your opponent has more cards to look at is true, but it's not. There are other downsides as well, so it all sorts of is a wash in the end. I think Militia's generally strong. You want to play it anyway. You especially want to play it with Council Room. So, but the Militia's not substantially worse because they start with a larger hand size, right? So what about the extra buy on Council Room? So, of course, sometimes that's going to be the only plus buy that you have in the kingdom, and depending on the kingdom, that can be really good. In general, plus buy tends to be a lot more useful when it's easier to buy multiple copies of cards because they cost less. If you think that Council Room is the only plus buy in the kingdom, and you want to build up to double province, then you're going to need to add at least 1 Council Room to your deck. But if the only way to actually generate money is going to be buying golds, then golds are really expensive. and they're not very efficient for their cost because they're just so expensive, and therefore it can actually be quite slow to build up all the way to double province. The plus buy is not necessarily helping you that much in a case like that. But if there's a load of good cheap cards, then plus buy starts being more useful earlier on, and therefore Council Room as a source of draw that's also giving you an extra buy can do a lot, because you want to add a lot of cheap cards to your deck. Then having the plus buy really helps out. So generally, whether or not Council Room is very useful for the plus buy, it's going to depend on the rest of the board, but you want to be looking for those very powerful cheaper cards like Throne Room. Specifically you're looking for cards that are going to speed you up quite a bit. Stuff like Merchant in base game, it's not super great. It's fine as a 3 cost, but it's not really fast enough to sort of make it feel like, the extra plus buy is going to be critical a bunch of the time. And base only, like the base set tends to not have super strong, what I call like spammable cheap cards. So like, obviously Chapel is very strong at 2, but there's no like 2 cost card that you want to amass a whole bunch of copies of and play as many of them as you can. They don't quite work like that, except maybe Village. That's sort of like one of the only ones that are really cheap in the base game that you're quite happy to have a lot of. And even then, Village is only doing so much for you. And that sort of leads on to an important point, which is that as you move away from base only and you start to look at other expansions, I think Council Room gets a bit better. First edition base, Council Room, like I say, makes for good big money, and big money's just a little bit better in a base first edition. But I think in like 2-player second edition, you're not really going to be going Council Room big money. So Council Room tends to feel quite weak in base only, particularly second edition. You will have seen as I do my various random kingdom analysis at the end of these videos, I usually don't really like Council Room that much. I think that Council Room can be quite weak compared to its peers. There's a lot of terminal draw in the base game as well. Like you've got your Junker, which is draw, you've got Moat, which is draw, you've got Smithy, which is very cheap and is a lot of draw. There's even Library as an alternative form of draw. Like there's just loads of it in the base game, and Council Room tends to miss out. It's a lot better than Moat, but otherwise, it's you've got Laboratory as well, haven't you? Yeah, there's just so much draw in the base game. But also with expansions, as you add them, the games tend to get faster in terms of turn count a lot of the time, just like as a general rule. And that is because the cards that you can draw at random also tend to be more powerful, particularly the later expansions. As Dominion cards have been made, typically they've gotten on the slightly stronger side. Like the base set is overall, power-wise, it's a bit all over the place, but on the whole, the cards tend to be a little bit weaker than the rest. And this means you're also more likely to find some really good cheap cards, so that even the plus buy tends to get a lot better. There's just better cards to buy at lower cost. And overall, I guess the main point here, Council Room tends to favour the faster strategy. So because something we said earlier, it speeds everyone up. If once somebody is playing Council Room, then everyone's strategies get faster. So Council Room can be really good if you're looking to do a strategy that tries to end the game very quickly. You don't really care about drawing your opponent extra cards because you're hoping that your strategy will be faster. And you're more likely, as you add expansions, to get these strategies that are just very, very fast, that would even beat big money in a rush to provinces. So normally, like, big money tends to do all right at getting provinces, but it's supporting other stuff like duchies that it just can't do. It just can't gain alternate victory cards very well, which gives time for the engine player to build up and then get multiple buys per turn and buy loads of cards. But sometimes, like, as you add expansions, more and more likely you're going to find that even a player playing big money just can't outpace a rush to provinces. You don't really see it that much in the base game either, to be fair, but it gets a lot worse, I would say, as you just add more powerful other cards to the game. So Council Room, I say, don't be put off by the fact that I tend to not like it that much in these Kingdom Analysis videos, because these are base only at the moment, where we're looking at the base set. And Council Room is not super great for engines in the base set, I would say. But the engine tends to win out in second edition. Council Room's a lot better with more players as well. So there you go. I think that's everything that I have to say about Council Room. Fairly weaker draw overall, but it has its moments. But you've really got to watch out because the benefit to your opponent is really nice. So let's go to the online client here and let's generate some boards containing Council Room, and we will assess the impact that Council Room has on these kingdoms. So here we've got Chapel and Sentry and Moneylender for trashing. There's a lot of trashing. We're not going to use Moneylender. We're going to open with Chapel. We really like to hit Artisan because we've got laboratories and markets that are really good. But what else are you doing? There's no village, I notice. So laboratories and markets. Artisan is the main... after you've chapelled, Artisan is going to be what you want to play as your one terminal per turn. So, eventually you swap over to Sentry and you get rid of the Chapel and you just use that to do your remaining trashing. But you can support a lot here. Adding money to your deck, you are going to need golds. You can't add money to your deck quickly enough with Market. I think you can build up probably to double province, and you've got the Artisan to help you also get an extra duchy towards the end, and I think that's pretty good. I think that's good enough to beat Council Room, big money. The problem, I guess, Council Room big money is fine, but if your opponent starts doing that early, they're actually going to help you get the Artisan, and you're going to pick up pretty well, and you have a really good time at amassing a load of duchies and supporting it. So I think Council Room just shouldn't really be played in this game. I think you ignore it completely here. You just you don't have the terminal space to play it. You've got better draw. So I think in 2-player at least, Council Room just isn't used there. What have we got here? So Chapel and Sentry again for trashing. We have Witch, Festival and Throne Room are like villages. We've got Laboratory again. Council Room, no, it's not the only plus buy there is for Festival. So we can trash down to a deck that's mostly full of actions. There will be Witch. With Throne Room and Witch, we can start witching our opponents pretty quick, which is going to be really good. It's easy to get because you got Sentry. You want to get one Sentry first. Open Chapel Silver here. I think you do that over Chapel Vassal. Maybe you just go for Chapel Vassal instead, actually. The Vassal's going to be nicer later on because you can thin down and get rid of all your treasures. And then you've got Festivals, Labs, Vassals. You can get enough money with Throne Room. You can junk your opponent to pieces if they try to do something funny like Council Room, big money or whatever. But how much do you need the Council Room? I think... Festival is nice, but you don't want too many because they sort of decrease your hand size. But you're going to have Witch for draw. Witch is a much better draw card here than Council Room. You will have some Festivals, but you will also be, as your main village, you will be throning Labs and Sentries, ideally, and possibly Vassals. So I think Council Room is sort of ignorable here. There's nothing on it that you really need, and you can trash down so thinly that the Witch is good enough for the draw, as are the Laboratories. So I think Council Room is also ignored on this board. Unless it's really late in the game, you may end up picking one up. You just need a load more draw to support the province, and you've got a load of Throne Rooms. That's fine, but I think you don't really get one early on. What have we got here? We've got Chapel for trashing. Throne Room is sort of like a village. It's going to be played on Laboratories, which we can gain with Artisan. There is Witch for trashing, which is all right here. But eventually your opponent's going to be drawing their deck, and they can trash quite easily with Chapel. So I think Witch is only okay here. It's got to be good. In general, you probably get one on your first 5, but you're going to open Chapel Militia. If you can get a Witch early, fine. Eventually you want an Artisan to pick up a load of Labs, and it will also get some Throne Rooms. Now, Council Room is the only plus buy here. How good is it as plus buy? Are we fine to just pick up one province per turn? Where's our money coming from? Let's see. Poacher is not great. It's only okay here. Yeah, where is our money coming from? I guess, do we have to buy golds? If we're going to have to buy golds, then I really sort of don't like the plus buy. I think Artisan to gain cards like this, I guess you can throne a militia when you've got it, so you don't need that many golds. But I think it's just kind of a little bit too slow to actually generate enough money to get to double province. You'd rather just single province here, and in that case I guess you just don't have no reason for the council room, because your Artisan is just gaining you labs and thrones and witches like as much as it can once you build up to 8. So yeah, so okay, so I guess council room's not really used here either, so we're having some very bad kingdoms for council room in this video. Like I say, again, you might want to pick one up late, but you need some way to get your money, and I'm not seeing how you get it on that board is the main problem, so the buy's not super great. What have we got here? Again, chapel for trashing, witch and militia. This is a very similar board to last time, but we have village and festival and vassal and merchant. So we've got a load of ways to buy some cards. Well, we've got festival for plus buy, and there's cheap cards as well. I mean, you got merchant, you got vassal, you got village. So there's a lot of stuff you can buy that's quite cheap. Drawing, you have witch. Earlier on, I'm going to like witch as my draw to get me to curse my opponent, which I guess I will do anyway because it's draw and I need draw. So you're going to open again like chapel militia, because militia's good to try and start your opponent getting the witch. You will have a festival at some point here for the buy. I guess a council room's probably okay to get one at some point. I would rather be playing a festival or two for buys, but I do like getting a load of merchants and vassals because your deck is quite thin here at some point, so the merchants are quite nice, and the vassals are quite nice as well, because you just don't need to have very many action cards. You can generate a lot of money that way. Artisan can gain you these cards as you need them. I think for a while you can actually get away with Festival and Witch, even though that draw's not so great, just because you can be very thin. And I think you can draw your deck, and even if you have like 1 or 2 curses, you can still trash them, because your only stock card's going to be silver plus whatever festivals are. And I guess you've got militia, but yeah, like I say, you will be drawing a bit with Witch, so I think you can survive that. I can see a council room being bought late here, just so that as you start adding provinces to your deck, the council room's going to be a much, much better draw than anything else. Witch doesn't really cut it. Like, council room's a lot better than a Witch. So to support the same number of stock cards, this will support 1, but this will support 3, so you need 3 times as many Witches, and you don't want festivals for that. So yeah, I think I will get a council room on this board. Of course, you have militia, so council room's effect is sort of undone, but I think it's just not something that you're going to be getting early on because you're thin. You don't really need the superpowered draw from council room, but later on it will be nice to support the provinces, and you can gain it very easily with Artisan. So council room's nice later on, I think. There are alternatives for buy earlier on. Some very complex analyses here. What's happening on this one? This is our last board. So, Chapel, Sentry, Witch, Artisan, and Militia. Wow, lots of very, very similar kingdoms that we're drawing here. Harbinger and Bureaucrat and Gardens all feel very terrible here. So this is very simple. Chapel, Sentry, Witch. What are you going to get with Artisan? I actually don't like Artisan that much here, thinking about it. So you're going to Chapel, Sentry and Witch, and you're going to try and win that split, I guess. That's just the best thing you can do here, but it's not that exciting. Once you're there, how do you draw with no laboratories, and there's no village? Yeah, so I sort of don't like Artisan here, because you can only play either Chapel or Witch or Militia. Militia's going to be the best card for a while. Yeah, I think I like playing Militia as often as I can, more than anything else. Is this board so weak that actually trashing down with Chapel is bad? That's an interesting thought to think about. The answer is no, because Witch will destroy you if you don't do that. So you have to trash down so you can start playing Witches until all the curses are gone, and then you shift over to Militia. So I think you open with a Militia chapel, you end up going for a Sentry and Witches, and that's just to keep yourself clean. I say Witches, just one Witch. And then eventually when they run out, you can look to get a Militia. You already have one. You can look to just play the Militia instead. And then I guess you're kind of just trying to buy golds. I don't know. So something about this feels really bad, actually. And I don't like it, but I don't see what else that you're able to do. If you gain an Artisan, instead of Militia, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to have terrible turns because you're going to have an Artisan in your hand and you've only got a 3-card hand. So I think you have to just play the Militia once the Witch runs out. And you're just going to really try and hit gold and then very slowly go up to single province. Wow, you're going to be here a while. But Gardens won't be... Is this so slow that Gardens actually wins against the Witch player? The problem is, what other pile are they going to empty? Because the Witch player can give you like 7 curses and then just stop playing the Witch. And then the Gardens player, Bureaucrat Gardens is terrible. I just don't see it working out. I think the Militia player does a lot better and gets pretty well a lot sooner. Yeah, you could, because they can just play Witch every turn for a couple of turns and then swap to Militia. Or they get an Artisan and they just pick up a load of duchies and stuff. So, okay, I guess Council Room, you haven't got the terminal space for it here, and I just hadn't considered Council Room at all in any of this discussion here, because it's just, it can't beat out the better draw that we have. And you can't support it. So yeah, so there you go. So Council Room was just not very good in those 5 example kingdoms that we looked at. And that's just how it tends to fare in base on 2-player, I guess. We will probably see it around more often as we start adding in expansions to these videos. And I'm sure it will have these boards where it's definitely pretty good. But we didn't see any here today. And that's just Council Room. It's only okay as a draw card. That each other player draws a card is really good, and so it's really good for your opponent is what I mean. It's actually really bad for you, and it's such a strong effect for your opponent that it's just you just don't want to play it a lot, and you don't want to play it early, and that's just how it is, and that's okay. But yeah, so Council Room is a sort of probably slightly below average, I think. Yeah, it's an alright card, but it loses out to other similar ones. Anyway, that was Council Room. I hope you enjoyed that video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.